car rolled slowly through Harlem, paint clean, engine calm, windows down just enough for people to see who was inside without staring too hard. Folks whispered that the doors could stop bullets, not from proof, but from repetition, while the driver stayed loose, knowing attention followed him everywhere. He walked through Rucker Park with cash in his pockets, not flashing, not hiding, carrying himself like somebody who already picked his lane. Long before outsiders realized a choice had been made, he had already turned away from the league, choosing motion over contracts and control over applause. That moment only makes sense once you rewind past the shine, back to crowded apartments, cracked courts, and lessons learned without explanations. Harlem during the 1950s and early 60s was loud, crowded, and constantly negotiating survival, where kids learned who mattered long before they learned long division. Public housing stacked families tight, which meant reputations traveled fast, mistakes stayed visible, and everybody noticed who moved smart or moved sloppily. Rucker Park sat at the center of that world, acting like both shelter and stage, where talent earned respect faster than speeches ever could. Games were never just recreation, since performance decided how people addressed you afterward, especially when money or protection entered conversations. Richard Kirkland was born on May 6, 1945, at Harlem Hospital, growing up inside that environment without special insulation or shortcuts. He picked up the nickname Pee-wee early, mostly tied to his size, while coordination showed up before muscle or height ever caught up. Dribbling came naturally, not polished, learned on uneven pavement where creativity mattered more than form or instruction. Around him, older guys hustled, talked numbers, handled disputes, and displayed status through possessions rather than promises, which shaped perspective quietly. Basketball and hustling never felt like opposites in his world, since both rewarded confidence, quick thinking, and showing up prepared. One path earned applause, while the other paid immediately, especially in a neighborhood where patience rarely produced security. Respect traveled quicker than opportunity, moving through word of mouth rather than institutions or waiting lists. Money spoke loud enough to override future talk, particularly when future outcomes stayed uncertain or delayed. By 13, Pee-wee was already involved in street activity, not as rebellion, but as an imitation of what visibly worked around him. Mary Buckheit later reported that he sold drugs young, noticing how cash changed treatment, mobility, and safety almost overnight. Owning nice things early shifted how adults spoke to him, which reinforced lessons no classroom addressed. That balance between court dominance and street presence started early, making basketball feel powerful but incomplete on its own. By high school, Pee-wee Kirkland's game started separating from normal categories, drawing crowds who came expecting spectacle rather than development. At Charles Evans Hughes High School, his scoring and handling stood out, mixing speed with control that defenders struggled to read. Crowds treated performances like events, reacting to flair, hesitation, and finishes that looked different from textbook fundamentals. That attention built a reputation faster than transcripts ever could, turning him into a name rather than a prospect. College basketball followed, first at Kittrell College in North Carolina, where he reportedly averaged 41 points per game. The number mattered less than how he scored, using creativity, timing, and confidence rather than physical dominance. Transfers eventually led him to Norfolk State University, where he played alongside Bob Dandridge, another future professional. There, he led the Spartans to a Division II Final Four appearance, earning CIAA Most Valuable Player honors in 1968. Even during college seasons, Rucker Park remained a parallel stage where his presence pulled crowds regardless of official schedules. Some players chased validation through coaches, while others chased contracts, but Pee-wee seemed focused on command. People came to watch him, not to scout him, which subtly shifted how institutions viewed his place. Recruiters saw skill, but also independence, which made control difficult inside structured systems. The Chicago Bulls drafted him in the 13th round in 1968, offering a conventional path many dreamed about. He attended camp, joined the roster briefly, then clashed with coach Dick Motta over role and usage. NBA salaries at that time stayed modest, hovering near $13,000 annually, which contrasted sharply with street earnings already available, leaving mid-season shocked fans, yet aligned with choices already rehearsed long before paperwork entered the picture. Norfolk State, the Bulls, and Rucker Park were all stops, not destinations, forming identity outside institutional validation. Basketball remained central, but never exclusive, serving as leverage rather than endpoint. By the time the league noticed potential, his sense of independence was already fixed. That independence made the NBA optional, not rejected loudly, simply set aside as another opportunity that arrived late. The Chicago Bulls selected Richard Pee Wee Kirkland in the 13th round of the 1968 NBA draft, which technically made him a professional, even if expectations stayed cautious. At that moment, the league still treated street guards like curiosities, valuing discipline and predictability more than improvisation or flair. Pee Wee arrived at training camp carrying a reputation from Rucker Park and Norfolk State, not polished obedience from structured systems. That difference showed early, not through outbursts, but through quiet resistance to how minutes, roles, and authority were assigned. Dick Motta coached the Bulls with control in mind, favoring structure, defensive commitment, and clear hierarchies that limited freelancing on the floor. Pee Wee's game thrived on reads made in motion, reacting to defenders rather than following diagrams drawn hours earlier. That gap created friction that stayed subtle, expressed through reduced minutes, bench time during road games, and instructions that narrowed his instincts. The issue was never talent, since teammates recognized his handle and court vision, but control, which the organization wanted to hold tightly. NBA salaries during the late 1960s averaged roughly $13,000 annually, even for rostered players who dressed nightly. That money came with taxes, scrutiny, and delayed payoff, while Pee Wee already moved larger sums through informal channels back home. Street earnings arrived immediately, without agents, without contracts, and without oversight from owners who dictated pace and purpose. Comparing those realities never required emotion or resentment, since numbers made the argument clear without discussion. During the season, Pee Wee walked away from the Bulls, returning to New York without press conferences or public complaints. The decision looked sudden from the outside, yet it followed a line already drawn long before his name entered league paperwork. Leaving was not a rejection of basketball, since he continued playing constantly, but a rejection of the constraint that limited his leverage. That move recalibrated priorities rather than burning bridges, keeping the NBA door open while stepping away from its terms. Back in Harlem, his visibility stayed intact, if not amplified, since the story circulated quickly that he left the league on his own terms. That narrative mattered more than any stat line, reinforcing the idea that he answered to himself rather than institutions. Rucker Park crowds treated him no differently, still gathering when he showed up, still watching for moments rather than resumes. From that point forward, basketball became a tool he controlled fully, not a system that controlled him. By the early 1970s, Pee Wee Kirkland's role in Harlem shifted from visible hustler to quiet organizer, a transition shaped by trust rather than intimidation. He understood early that street longevity depended less on corners and more on capital movement behind closed doors. Selling products directly brought attention, while financing deals created distance and insulation from daily exposure. That awareness pushed him towards structure instead of chaos, favoring consistency over confrontation. Heroin distribution in Harlem followed layered systems where product moved through hands quickly, often faster than protection or enforcement could track. Pee Wee positioned himself near the top of those layers, supplying capital, sourcing volume, and stabilizing operations when cash flow tightened. He loaned money to other dealers, financed bulk purchases, and expected repayment with discipline rather than emotion. People depended on his liquidity during dry spells, while quietly resenting how much influence that dependence created. His reputation as the Bank of Harlem developed through repetition, not self-promotion, built on reliability during moments when others folded. Dealers knew he could front money without hesitation, expecting returns handled cleanly and on schedule. That role placed him at the center of networks without forcing him onto the street daily. Influence grew through numbers and timing, not through visible violence or noise. Relationships formed across Harlem's upper tier during that period, including figures like Nicky Barnes and Guy Fisher, though alliances stayed fluid rather than fixed. Cooperation happened when interests aligned, then dissolved without ceremony when circumstances shifted. Pee Wee avoided binding himself too tightly, preferring flexibility over loyalty that demanded enforcement. That approach reduced exposure during inevitable power struggles that followed the era. One widely reported account described Pee Wee trading stolen jewelry to organized crime intermediaries in exchange for large quantities of heroin. Money moved through him quickly, stored in apartments, vehicles, and safe locations rather than banks that invited scrutiny. He avoided excess paperwork, relying on memory, trusted associates, and repetition to track obligations. That system worked until federal attention followed volume rather than violence. His insulation delayed consequences, yet the scale eventually attracted attention regardless of caution. During this period, Pee Wee's public image stayed controlled, visible enough to maintain respect, restrained enough to avoid unnecessary attention. He dressed well, drove expensive cars, and moved comfortably through Harlem without broadcasting intent. Rumors followed him closely, including stories about armored vehicles and unreachable wealth, though confirmation rarely mattered. Perception carried weight on its own, shaping how people approached him. Despite growing wealth, resentment traveled alongside reliance, since power rarely distributes evenly without friction. Some viewed him as a stabilizing force, others as a gatekeeper controlling access to opportunity. That tension remained contained through mutual benefit rather than affection. People did business with him because systems worked, not because trust came easily. By the time law enforcement focused seriously on his operation, Pee Wee had already shifted identity from dealer to financier. His exposure stemmed from scale rather than recklessness, drawing scrutiny through volume, not conflict. That distinction mattered later, shaping how cases were built and prosecuted. Influence accumulated quietly, yet consequences followed eventually, regardless of discretion. This period marked the peak of his financial reach, where control came from liquidity rather than physical presence. Streets already offered immediate return, scalable systems, and authority earned without committees. Basketball still existed alongside it all, but business now set the rhythm. That balance defined the phase before everything slowed, long before courtrooms replaced private rooms. By the early 1970s, Pee Wee Kirkland's presence in Harlem came packaged with visuals people could not ignore, especially the cars, the clothes, and the calm confidence. He moved through neighborhoods in expensive vehicles, often foreign, often spotless, carrying himself like attention no longer surprised him. Rolls Royces, Mercedes, and sports cars became part of his silhouette, not as trophies, but as everyday tools of movement. Seeing that level of access in a place where scarcity shaped daily decisions left a lasting impression on everybody watching. What people actually saw mattered more than what they knew, since documentation rarely circulated on the streets the way stories did. Folks noticed that he drove openly without rushing, parked comfortably, and never looked over his shoulder in visible panic. That confidence suggested insulation, whether real or imagined, which fueled conversations that traveled block to block without verification. When someone lives visibly untouched, observers fill gaps with explanation. That was how the bulletproof Porsche story took shape, not through evidence, but through repetition that hardened into assumption. Nobody produced paperwork, armor specs, or first-hand confirmation, yet the rumor stayed alive through constant retelling. One person said the doors could stop rounds, another said the glass was reinforced, then somebody else said he tested it himself. Over time, speculation gained weight simply by surviving unchecked. In Harlem, rumors functioned as more than gossip, since they doubled as warnings wrapped inside storytelling. Saying a man drove a bulletproof car told listeners that approaching him carried consequences beyond normal risk. That narrative discouraged opportunists while reinforcing status without direct confrontation. Myth acted like a shield, built from words rather than metal. What remained documented stayed thinner, consisting mostly of visible wealth, expensive tastes, and a lifestyle that looked insulated from everyday threats. Pee Wee never publicly confirmed armored vehicles, never posed for photos demonstrating protection, never leaned into the myth directly. That silence allowed stories to breathe, since denial often weakens legend rather than containing it. Absence of confirmation became part of the appeal. People also noticed how freely he carried money, not flaunting, but never hiding either, which added another layer to perception. Cash in pockets suggested liquidity, while generosity reinforced power quietly without speeches. Giving money away in small moments signaled abundance more effectively than hoarding ever could. Those gestures stuck in memory longer than numbers. Over time, the story around him grew larger than any single action, combining cars, cash, and confidence into one continuous image. The legend outpaced verifiable detail, shaped by an environment that rewarded narrative over paperwork. Harlem understood symbols, using them to map danger, ambition, and hierarchy without formal systems. Pee Wee became one of those symbols, regardless of how much truth backed each detail. As Pee Wee Kirkland's name traveled, younger hustlers studied him without needing introductions, watching from a distance rather than sitting under direct instruction. Influence rarely required meetings, since visibility alone taught lessons through behavior, style, and outcome. People noticed how he dressed, how he moved, how he avoided chaos while still controlling space. Observation replaced mentorship in environments where proximity carried risk. That context matters when discussing the Alpo-Martinez connection, which often gets overstated through hindsight rather than documentation. Alpo rose to prominence during the mid-'80s, years after Pee Wee's peak, operating in a different era shaped by crack rather than heroin. Their timelines overlapped culturally, not operationally, which blurs clarity when stories compress decades. The association came from shared geography and reputation rather than proven instruction. Street culture often assigns lineage retroactively, especially when someone succeeds loudly and people search for origin stories. Saying someone learned from Pee Wee added weight, even if learning happened indirectly through observation. Watching how a man handled money, conflict, and visibility taught more than conversations ever could. That kind of influence spreads without names attached. Younger hustlers copied what worked, borrowing discipline, patience, and presentation while adjusting to new markets. Pee Wee represented a template of control, showing that chaos was optional when structure existed. That template stayed relevant even as drugs changed, since money management principles carried across eras. Style evolved, but posture stayed recognizable. People also projected mentorship where none was confirmed, since connection adds legitimacy to newer figures. Saying someone came from Pee Wee's shadow placed them inside a lineage of Harlem power. Documentation rarely mattered in those claims, since street history values recognition over records. If enough people repeat a version, it gains standing regardless of proof. Pee Wee never publicly claimed protégés, rarely attaching his name to younger hustlers' actions or outcomes. That distance kept him insulated while allowing stories to circulate freely. Silence again worked as permission, letting others build narratives without correction. Myths filled spaces left open. Legacy in street culture works less like a resume and more like a mirror, reflecting what observers want to see. Some saw Pee Wee as a mentor, others as a model, others simply as a reference point. Each version served a purpose, depending on who told it. The truth lived somewhere quieter, shaped by influence without contracts. Pee Wee's impact came from presence, not classroom teaching, influencing generations without formal acknowledgement. In Harlem, that kind of legacy carries weight equal to documented mentorship. The story survived not because it was proven, but because it made sense to the people telling it. By the early 1970s, federal attention around Harlem narcotics shifted from street corners toward financial patterns, which quietly narrowed the space Pee Wee Kirkland operated inside. Surveillance followed money trails instead of gunfire, tracking volume, repetition, and relationships rather than visible violence. Informants surfaced from pressure points created by arrests lower in the chain, offering fragments that gradually aligned into something usable. None of it happened overnight, since the case built slowly, layer by layer, without spectacle. Agents focused on how heroin moved, who financed bulk transactions, and which names appeared repeatedly when money changed hands. Pee Wee's insulation delayed direct exposure, yet scale always leaves residue, especially when numbers grow faster than discretion. Associates questioned on unrelated charges began mentioning his role as a financier rather than a corner presence. Those mentions stayed consistent enough to matter once cross-referenced. In April 1971, federal authorities arrested Pee Wee Kirkland on charges tied to conspiracy to distribute narcotics, connecting him to a large-scale heroin movement throughout Harlem. The arrest landed heavily, not just personally, but symbolically, since many viewed him as untouchable until that moment. Court documents framed him as a wholesale supplier, someone operating above street level with reach across multiple crews. The case relied on financial exposure, corroborated testimony, and the accumulation of patterns rather than dramatic incidents. During trial proceedings in the Southern District of New York, prosecutors leaned on informants who had been pressured by their own legal trouble. Defense arguments challenged credibility, suggesting cooperation came from desperation rather than truth. Despite that pushback, the structure of the case held, supported by overlapping testimony and transaction records. Conviction followed, leading to a 15-year federal sentence that removed him from Harlem's daily rhythm. Incarceration shocked him more than his routine, since it stripped away movement, visibility, and access simultaneously. He entered Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, carrying a reputation but lacking the freedom that sustained it. Adjustment came quickly, not through withdrawal, but through reorganization of identity inside a controlled space. Basketball became the bridge between past control and present limitation. Inside Lewisburg, Pee Wee joined the prison basketball league, facing teams from surrounding towns in organized competition. Games drew attention not because of novelty, but because his dominance translated seamlessly into confined systems. He scored 100 points in a single game, then later surpassed that with a reported 135-point performance. Those numbers mattered less as records than as signals of continuity. Control inside prison came through consistency, discipline, and command of the environment, traits he already possessed. Basketball provided structure, routine, and recognition without requiring external validation. Other inmates followed his lead, not through intimidation, but through demonstrated competence. The court became a space where identity stayed intact. Prison staff recognized his leadership, allowing him limited autonomy within programs. Time passed measured by seasons rather than deals, shifting pace without erasing presence. By 1974, after serving roughly 4 years, early release arrived through good behavior and system pressure. Returning to Harlem placed him back into a landscape that felt familiar, yet altered by absence. His name still carried weight, yet operations continued without him, reshaped by others who filled gaps. The release signaled unfinished business, not closure, since time away rarely erases established roles. That return marked a continuation rather than a conclusion. Freedom after release felt conditional, shaped by memory rather than momentum, since Harlem kept moving during his absence. Pee Wee re-entered with awareness, understanding that prior insulation no longer guaranteed distance from scrutiny. He explored legitimate ventures, including business interests meant to stabilize income without exposure. That attempt reflected adjustment rather than surrender. Federal authorities revisited his records, focusing on unreported income accumulated before incarceration. Tax exposure offered a quieter avenue for accountability, similar to methods used against organized crime figures decades earlier. The approach targeted accumulation rather than activity. In 1981, prosecutors charged Pee Wee Kirkland with tax evasion, alleging substantial unpaid obligations to the Internal Revenue Service. Unlike narcotics cases, this one required little informant testimony, relying instead on documented discrepancies. Defense options narrowed quickly since paper trails resist reinterpretation. Consequence caught up without confrontation. Pee Wee accepted responsibility through a guilty plea, receiving a 10-year federal sentence at La Tuna Federal Correctional Institution in Texas. That incarceration differed sharply from the first, stripping away remaining illusions of control. Time stretched differently, measured by reflection rather than adaptation. The long stop forced internal reckoning rather than external management. Inside La Tuna, focus shifted toward education and introspection rather than dominance. He studied social sciences, psychology, and philosophy, seeking frameworks to understand choices previously accepted without question. Spiritual exploration followed, leading him toward Islam as a structure for discipline and meaning. Faith provided order when movement disappeared entirely. Basketball remained present, though no longer central, serving more as a routine than an identity anchor. Physical dominance mattered less than mental adjustment, especially as age and environment reshaped priorities. Inmates respected his past, yet interactions centered around conversation rather than competition. Time slowed purposefully. Years passed quietly, marked by study, prayer, and distance from the world that once defined him. Outside, Harlem shifted through the mid-'80s, transitioning from heroin to crack, altering economics and violence patterns. Figures rose and fell without his presence, reshaping narratives he no longer controlled. Absence eroded relevance gradually. Release arrived in 1988, returning him to a neighborhood transformed beyond recognition. Younger faces replaced familiar ones, and systems operated under different rules. The scale he once commanded no longer existed in the same form. Reintegration required humility rather than assertion. He moved into mentoring and coaching roles, eventually working at the Dwight School in Manhattan as a counselor and basketball coach. Students responded to structure, discipline, and experience delivered without glorification. That role reframed authority through guidance rather than leverage. Basketball returned as a teaching tool rather than a currency. Harlem remembered him selectively, preserving legend while forgetting context. Some still spoke his name with reverence, others barely recognized it. Power faded into memory, replaced by stories repeated rather than influence exercised. Time-completed work incarceration began. The second fall closed the chapter on control through scale, replacing it with measured presence and distance. What remained was a perspective shaped by loss, time, and adaptation. Harlem continued, indifferent yet familiar. The long stop ended, leaving behind a man changed by absence rather than victory. By the time the money stopped moving the way it once did, Pee Wee Kirkland existed more as memory than presence, a name spoken rather than a force felt. Harlem no longer adjusted itself around his schedule, yet his imprint stayed layered into conversations, courts, and old stories retold without urgency. People remembered how he moved, not where he lived, and how he carried himself, not what he owned at the end. That shift marked the quiet transition from operator to reference point. His work after release leaned into structure instead of scale, taking shape through coaching, counseling, and speaking rather than organizing or financing. At the Dwight School in Manhattan, he worked with students who knew him more as a coach than a legend, responding to discipline delivered without hype. Basketball returned as a teaching language, translating habits, patience, and preparation into something practical. Authority came from experience, not leverage. Speaking engagements followed, often in gyms, schools, and community spaces where his past carried weight without needing embellishment. He talked about choices, pressure, and time passing, rarely framing his story as triumph or regret. Listeners leaned in since he did not sell redemption, only continuity shaped by consequence. That tone matched a man who understood how narratives drift when pushed too hard. Outside classrooms, his name continued circulating through hip-hop lyrics and street storytelling, often detached from dates or details. Rappers referenced him to signal credibility, agility, or old Harlem power, compressing decades into single lines. Street conversations treated his story like folklore, blending fact, rumor, and assumption without concern for accuracy. Cultural memory prioritized feeling over verification. Rumors never disappeared, lingering around armored cars, hidden money, and unseen influence, surviving precisely because no resolution arrived. Pee Wee never confirmed or denied most stories, allowing space for imagination to work uninterrupted. That silence preserved ambiguity, which legends require to stay alive across generations. Unanswered questions outlast documented answers. People debated whether he mentored figures like Alpo Martinez, often ignoring timelines or evidence, preferring lineage that made sense emotionally. Association mattered more than proof, especially in cultures where visibility shapes belief. Those connections lived through repetition rather than confirmation, reinforcing how stories solidify without documentation. Legacy formed through proximity, not contracts. Age reframed everything, slowing movement and reducing visibility while sharpening perspective. The cars no longer circled Harlem blocks, yet the image remained parked in memory, untouched by updates. Distance replaced motion, allowing reflection without performance. Time did what prisons and courts could not. Returning to the opening image of movement, the difference now lay in absence rather than presence. The streets no longer tracked his steps, yet still carried echoes of how he once passed through them. Visibility faded, but recognition stayed selective, appearing when stories demanded an anchor. That balance defined how legends age. Nothing closed neatly, since lives like his rarely offer conclusions that feel final. Pee Wee Kirkland remained a reference rather than a verdict, remembered through fragments rather than summaries. Continuity replaced closure, letting the story breathe without instruction. The road stayed visible even after the car stopped moving.